So maybe I'll just start for a second, just because I think the leadership comes up in both your worlds, although coming at it a little differently, but maybe they all end up with God or something, I'm not sure. But it's just the faith issues. But you know, leadership is taught in many different ways in many different professions, but not necessarily towards the greater good of the community or the people. And so I think some of your very direct principles, Nina, and how you actually deliver on the 7 cases is very interesting, and obviously I'd like to learn more. And Doran's training the leaders to really be leaders, to create the change, are related, but it's not so easy to find leaders. And just training people doesn't mean that they become leaders. So I'm sort of curious what you would say about those ideas.
Button. There we go. Okay. So,
Just training people doesn't mean they're leaders.
that's true. So, a path to, well, I guess what I would say is leaders don't exist and we don't find them, in my experience. Like people, there might be people who have a more present yearning to know that they're seeking something and they're seeking some experience and they're hungry for something. But I would say that when new organizers come into this work, whether it's in our organization or I work with community organizers all over the country, the first thing I hear them say is there aren't any leaders. And that would be heresy in our culture that we build. So that is like lesson number 1 is, of course, there are not a set of people out there waiting for you to find them. Your job as an organizer is to find the hunger and the yearning and begin to orient those people to uncover and unpack that, and then equip them with some public skills to be, you know, like it's not just like you actually have to have some skills. When I use the phrase public skills. So that can mean everything like, it can be as simple as, how do I run a meeting that isn't really boring? Like so. Or how do I powerfully invite someone else who also has a yearning to join me? Because if it's just you, then you're not leading anyone. A leader has followers, is like one of our principles, like you can move other people. So that is a craft, a skill, and a practice. And I would argue that a lot of people in many settings get some access to that journey. Like you have, whether we call it that or not, like I become a teacher or I'm a professional, there's some access to the journey of what do I really want and what am I really seeking and what is my passion in life and how do I organize my field or my place of work or my place in change making. Or but a lot of people don't have access to that journey. So when we start to give people access to that journey and have an experience, you'd be surprised at how many leaders emerge. I mean, people emerge who do things that they never thought they'd be able to do, and probably the organizer or top leaders who work with them also thought they'd never be able to do. You know? People are filled with potential. So I guess I reject the idea that sort of the privilege of leadership is somehow like only for the few. I think all people can have some access to the experience of moving around their own vision and having some public skills to be able to live it out in some way. It doesn't mean everybody turns into Barack Obama, you know, but, or Martin Luther King. But for some people, that experience of agency can be, I finally got the women's group together in my congregation, and we participated in getting dairy, the dairy industry, or I participated in making my school a better place. That's also leadership.
So I actually probably ditto, but just two other thoughts. In my experience over the last 10 years with the Healthy Native Community Fellowship, which is a leadership development, it's all of this support, and there's skills, there's practice. It's going back and putting theory into practice in terms of week-long trainings and then going back and practice. And it's the developing of a community of practice of people. It's who can depend on each other, can call each other, get help. And it isn't just that the leadership is chosen because they're tribal councilmen or whatever. There's secretaries who are in the reception person at the health department paired with someone who's a Head Start teacher who's paired with someone. They form their own teams, and they come and they have their own powerful transformational experiences, and they build this community of practice. So I actually think what PolicyLink is doing in this state of building a community of practice around people in health departments and some academics and who are trying to support each other in this work is really key. And so if that's a recommendation, I would say figuring out how to create communities of practice. They can be local or statewide or across the nation, as to help people, but not to deny anyone that chance to emerge. And especially like working with youth, the idea of putting one single token youth on a community advisory board is a disaster. You create youth leaders by creating youth teams together, working together, and they create each other. Not all will emerge with the same level of leadership, but some might. And so that's one. And also, I do think leaders within academia are really important, and I've been fortunate to be part of the Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Center that's been supporting scholars of color to develop health policy within the social sciences. And I do think that we have to change academia so that equity becomes much more primary as an important, and I would say that there's leadership. I've done a lot of mentorship in academia of how you do this work. And I think that's a very important part of our role as senior people, if people are in those positions, to do that mentorship, even not, this is not at the community level, but within academia to support people to be successful, scholars of color especially.
Thank you. We'll have Andrew, Bashira, and Nick. Andrew?
Wonderful stuff, thank you. And hard to keep up, right, thinking about so much of what you're saying. So my question is about the, to use Doran's terms, right, power, agency, capacity to act. You both spent a lot of time talking about those things. And the distinction between those as means to, right, promoting healthy communities, health equity, and those as forms of health, right, of good health themselves. So clearly on the, as a means to an end, you both talked in your respective contexts about, Doran, you said it may not happen, right? It may not happen at all if the community doesn't get behind something. And it certainly doesn't happen in both organizing and research in the way it does if the community gets involved. And you talk about expanding capacity, but all of those, again, are sort of instrumental. But what about, can you say something, and you did already, but can you say something even a bit more pointed about, the value for people's health of being agents in their own lives?
Well, I do think there's constructs for that in the health world in terms of the empowerment world. There's psychological, organizational, and community empowerment. And the psychological empowerment and has within it just the participation. There's a couple of within that. Just participating itself is health enhancing. Believing that the collective has the capacity to make a difference is health enhancing. So having political efficacy, which is that I can testify to the governor, that itself is health enhancing. So I think there's a substantial literature there in the empowerment. Even what's been, I kind of was trying to get away from saying we only depend on academic publication, but even with what's been published in terms of that participation itself is really key to this world, to change the world, and of the inequitable conditions. And it's enhancing, even if you don't ever reach that end, in terms of the social support, the social networks, the reciprocal trust, the social capital. There's all kinds of intermediate health enhancing, the idea that walking clubs, you know, you create that social net, you actually walk and you create that social network, and there's the additional motivation because you're now walking with friends because now they become friends, you know, that all leads to, it doesn't necessarily change the inequitable conditions of unsafe streets or lack of lights in poor neighborhoods to create safe walking spaces, but it's a start of all kinds of health enhancing behaviors and just supports that. So I think there's many levels of change here. And of course, I do believe in multi-level. I think we do need to get safe streets, and we need to have people have lights and you know, so to promote active living and all of that. So I don't think one denies the other. But I do think just participating, there's a lot of literature to support that.
For sure.
Great presentation by both of you, and as I'm listening to the role, whether it's community organizing, the faith-based or the non-faith-based community organizing, or CBPR, can play a significant role in advancing health equity. I heard lots of great ideas and great suggestions. You know, as I look back at the task in front of us as a committee of developing a report that identify concrete community-based solutions to advancing health equity, if you had to choose one or two strategies from community organizing and CBPR to include in that report, what would your top strategy be that you really would like to see in that report?
I'm trying to think of one sentence. I think if the report reflected this question about agency and capacity as itself being health protective and health promotive, is that a word? Anyway, that essential component or ingredient or what foundation for what it takes to fundamentally create the kind of change that we're trying to describe in this room is often as if it's a side, it's like a side benefit that would be nice, as opposed to an essential pillar or the foundation for long-term change that's going to unfold. And I think we're either trying to make the case that it's instrumental for political purpose. I mean, a lot of the environments I'm in, they're like, can you organize those people to pass this policy? That's more the transactional dynamic that happens a lot. But it can happen also in terms of program or policy. Or the problem is if you don't create the space and time for the work that Nina has been describing, or that we do, you choke it off before it even begins. It kills it. So a lot of the work that I think people who understand that this is the heart, you spend a lot of time trying to protect it and make the case to a lot of people, but you're really trying to protect the human experience and infrastructure and capacity that you know is the heart of any change that's going to happen. And until we make that visible, we will keep ending up in the same space, which is we don't have the human capacity or the democratic capacity in our communities or our country to achieve this kind of change.
Well, just taking the democratic capacity as a given, I think, is really important, and adding to it from a knowledge-based science perspective, how do we decolonize knowledge so that we're open to multi-level, multi-evidences, understandings of even the theory of the problem. You know, we talk about, you know, how do we understand the problem? Communities may understand it differently in different communities, you know, so how do we unpack and allow that democratic participation of the evidences that people see and bring to the table so that they can craft, not to put all of the onus, though, on communities to do it alone, because they're burdened. The money is being sucked out of communities. It's blaming the the old blaming the victim again. How do we do this in a collaborative way across? So I keep using the word, it's the multi-universe, multiple sectors working together, policymakers working with community members, academics from the multi-evidence working from their understanding of evidence to the evidence that's emerging from communities, whatever community, can be a disability community, that whatever those communities are, that those communities have equal opportunity to have their voice be heard. And I talk a lot about cultural centeredness and contextualizing. And so I think it's the multiple universe and multiple sector, multi-level, qualitative ways of thinking. And then this idea of cultural centeredness to me is, I go to Mohan Dutta's, who's a health communication scholar, way of thinking about it, which is really back to what Doran is saying. It's around voice and agency. It's the agency of people to name their own and demand their own and to be heard. And so that makes something cultural centered, not putting on a feather just because you think Indians use feathers. I mean, it's a voice being heard. It's having your perspective. It's procedural justice. It's having your perspective at the table. And so that kind of mirrors what Doran is saying, but trying to put it a little bit into also a scientific, academic perspective here of this. There are these different sources of knowledge that we need each other and different sectors. Health is not, as you've probably heard, and I think from previous testimony, you need transportation sector and economic sector and planning, urban planning and rural planning, and you need all of this. I was schooled in the World Health Organization, Healthy Community from 1986, the Ottawa Charter, and it's multi-sector organizing is, again, really critically important for any health outcome. The organizing.
I totally agree with all of this. I'm having difficulty in trying to understand, how do I take this and articulate it into a one or two statement recommendations that, based on your work, you think should happen or should be included in the report? And it doesn't have to come up right now, but would love to kind of, after the meeting, if you can follow up with us, was like, what would be one or two concrete recommendations that should be included in that report? Would love to hear that, and it doesn't have to be right now.
This is Nick. I'm from South Dakota. My first question is about Isaiah and Pico, and just how Native communities have been being engaged or not engaged. I'm not from Minnesota, but I know that there's 11 tribes in Minnesota, and 7 of them are Chippewa, Anishinaabe, and 4 of them are Dakota. And they have a really unique relationship with the federal government from a lot of different populations. And it's probably hard to narrow down a leader, and even to get a leader to admit that they're a faith-based leader is probably really challenging. But
There's a little conflict there.
So I'm curious about how Isaiah has been doing that successfully or even unsuccessfully. And also there's 566 federally recognized tribes, and so I wonder about how PICO does it on a national scale.
Yeah.
Both with tribes, but also with particularly the larger land-based tribes, where there is probably a lot more community organized happening with the larger land-based tribes. And then with the urban population, like Minneapolis has like the second largest native urban population in the country. So that question is for you. And then for Nina, this model in which you're working with native communities is great. I mean, this is like a breath of fresh air a little bit compared to the stuff that we've dealt with in the past. And so I'm just curious about how your partnership with Indian country and native communities is looking to expand beyond the Chippewa in Minnesota and Anishinaabe in Minnesota and beyond the Navajo and the Pueblos in New Mexico.
So, so I guess the first thing I would say, and I was just in a conversation with somebody about this recently, and we kind of had a push and pull about it. So I don't have a permanent stance on this. I think particularly in community organizing, it's not, the question is not, is every particular organization representing or incorporating every constituency, because it might not be right if you bring your perspective to the table. Isaiah is a particularly Christian, denominationally based, it's mainline Protestant, Catholic, you know, the traditional African American Baptist denominations, and a sprinkling of evangelicals and some Unitarians. So the history of the Christian church in Minnesota and the native tribes is a terrible one. From the boarding schools, the forced boarding schools of children, essentially the abduction of children into Catholic and Christian kind of assimilation strategies. There's a history of incredible violence, and that has to be recognized. So I don't know that Isaiah is the right organization to say we're the ones that would be the right representative, or maybe it's the word is vehicle. Are we the right vehicle? So then the question becomes, are we wrestling as an organization with how are we partnering, aligning, reconciling, being in respectful relationship with the power building and organizing that's going on, both on the land-based tribes and in Minneapolis, around education, around water rights. And especially as we've expanded into greater Minnesota, that's become an emergent conversation that's unfolding, is how do we be a powerful partner and respectful partner, and begin to actually create some of those conversations that probably really need to happen between people who come from a, you know, Euro-Christian tradition from the Homestead Act in Minnesota, and people who have had their land taken from them and have fought for their land and their history and their traditions. So that conversation is unfolding, and it's a really difficult one. It's also happening in PICO, I think particularly in California. There actually is an organizing project that's a part of PICO that is primarily Native grounded, which is the first time I've actually seen a faith-based organizing network actually have a real project that's owned and being led from Native communities. So that's what I'd say about that at this point.
So on our end, I think on my end, the Healthy Native Community Fellowship, which is run out of a nonprofit in the Shiprock area, is national. And it has fellow teams all over the country. It's had, I think now 125 teams representing not all 566 nations, but many. It's moved into a lot. Every single region of the country, and some regions being more represented than others. And I think the organizing there at very much using a medicine wheel as a pan-Indian symbol of life cycle, of different sources of knowledge, of listening, dialogue, action, kind of a Freirean model as well. So I think that there's some national work happening that's quite wonderful. And they're findable on the Healthy Native Community Partnership. There's a lot of work happening. I think it's hncppartners.org. Our particular kind of effort, we've been receiving a lot of interest by other tribes around our Family Listening, Family Circle project, and so we're trying to create a dissemination support model where our tribal research teams can train others, you know, not coming necessarily from UNM, but University of New Mexico, but that there can be cross-sharing. But there's also a network, there's multiple networks of Native researchers and allies who are trying to work together to create a community of practice. I do think this idea of a community of practice, I have to think about your question of kind of succinct recommendations. I appreciate that question. But a community of practice across Indian country of both Native researchers and allies who are working together in communities to try and learn from each other, and because there's serious health inequities, and historic trauma, historical trauma has been well documented. And so I do think that that's growing. And the National Congress of American Indian Policy Research Center, I've worked with them, and that's a tribally led organization since the 40s. And they for sure have networks of scholars in Indian country that are trying also to work with community partners. And so I know a lot of there's networks. And it's important, I think, for a committee not to try and invent new networks, but to ask communities to plug into multiple existing networks for this kind of change transformation to happen. And maybe each health department has to find their networks, and tribal communities have to find their networks, and there might be just different networks of people working together around equity issues, and those are going to be important. It's an important, I think, strategy.
We have 3 more questions, so I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit and ask Kendall, Bill, and Allison to give their questions, and then hold your responses to hear them. And then we have lunch together, which you're hopefully going to join us, so we can have more discussion. So, Kendall?
Thank you for your presentations. I'm Kendall, one of the Anniversary Fellows. My question is in regard to your definition of power for Dorian. I was really impressed by what you said, because the thing that I thought about was the word authority. Mm-hmm. And you didn't mention that word at all in what you talked about. You talked about developing capacity to act and the ability to act. And I got from what you said that you were talking about building people. Mm-hmm. Can you comment on that a little bit and why that word wasn't a part and kind of how you all think about that?
Say. So I mean.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's wrong. Sorry.
Keep it.
That was a good one.
You're ready for that one. So Bill, Allison, and Chandra, could you ask your question succinctly, please?
Yes. I really liked your construct on capacity to act, the building of grassroots leadership, the building of democratic organizations, and then building power. It matches my life experience, and I think it's absolutely right. You have mentioned a number of times that you're a faith-based organization. I can see that faith-based organizations bring a structure, congregations with leadership and the like, to the issue. But other orientations bring the same. Tribes have their own structures. Labor unions have their own. Is there something I missed? Is there some reason why faith-based is a particularly important aspect here?
Allison.
I had a brief question for Dorian as well. You spoke a number of times around a policy issue and the need to organize, let's say, 500 people or to act on a particular issue. Can you talk a little bit about where the agenda comes from and what sort of community organizing you do to establish that agenda of what the issues are for that community?
And Chandra.
I was really struck by your use of, when you described, Dorian, the sense that you need to protect communities from potential exploitation. And I feel this sort of tension, which is, what if the evidence produces something that organizations or other entities might be able to capitalize on in ways that actually does not, that might actually make or lead communities to feel the need to go through these consolidated entities in order to enact the kinds of outcomes that we ostensibly seek. I don't know if that is clear, but it seems to me, on the one hand, that we're arguing for, or that you're arguing for the dissemination of capacity among people so that they don't have to rely on, for instance, health maintenance organizations or anything else. On the other hand, those kinds of organizations are invested in doing this work in part because of the benefits that come from being able to say that they recognize and they support communities' efforts to build their own capacity. To me, it seems like there's the potential for some tension there between who holds the strings in terms of ultimately who holds the strings in deciding how those things function going forward. And if my question made any sense, I'd appreciate comments from both of you on that.
So here's what I suggest out of respect for our speakers that we have after lunch so we can keep on time. Everyone in the room is invited to lunch, and so we could sort of continue the conversation there. And also, if you're comfortable and you have specific answers to any of these questions, you can also send them to me in writing, and I can share those with the committee. And just so you know, everything that's submitted to the committee goes in our public access file, which is available in our office if anyone ever wants to see what was submitted to the committee, just so you know. It's just a part of our Federal Advisory Committee Act requirements. But I can explain that to you after.
That means anything I write could be accessed.
No, anything that I share with the committee, anything that's
Got it.
specifically for the committee,
Okay.
not like our organizing calls and, no.
But I think, first, thank you, we're sorry because of the timing, but your wonderful presentations, I think some of the questions are really to try to help us write the report.
Yeah.
So it's not, it's, your organizations are wonderful examples, that's why you're here.
Right.
So thank you so much, and we can talk at lunch, and I apologize to our committee members for this as well, because there's just never enough time. So thank you so much, and we'll go to lunch now?
Yeah,
Where you want?
so lunch is, just make a right out of here, and it's all the way down at the end. It's buffet style, and then the bathrooms are on your way down there on the right if you need them. And we'll reconvene at, we'll go to 10 minutes late so everyone has time. We'll start at 12:40 on the dot.
I just also want to thank the committee for your inquiry into this aspect of the work. It's just really powerful that you're asking the question. So thank you for having us here.
Yeah, I also want to echo it. I'm very excited by your work, so thank you.